thank you for the invitation to share some of the stuff we're doing down here in Florida. Briefly, I'm going to take you through just a quick overview of the problems that we have here in Florida with invasive species, talk about prevention and risk analysis, and how that, that leads right into the program that I oversee, the IFAS assessment and non-native plants, and then talk to you about some new developments we have coming out of our program. But before we get started, I know if y'all have been watching the news in the last few weeks, it gets cold in Florida sometimes. And we had a cold snap recently, and these falling iguanas made it onto the national news scene. Iguanas, you know, are not native to South Florida, but they are prolific and invasive down there. These are the kind of stories that get Florida on the national news, and just is kind of a really good example of just some of the high profile invasive species issues that we deal with. And I just thought it was timely to share. But why is Florida so overrun by non-native species and invaders? This is because we have a tropical, subtropical climate that overlaps with many of the most biodiverse regions in the world. We're also a tourism and trade hotspot. So we have the ports of Miami, Tampa, Jacksonville. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple, but where you have some major trade that goes through there. We also have cruise ships. You think of all the international flights and Disney World, Universal. There's a lot of opportunities for intentional and unintentional introductions. In fact, 85% of all non-native plants in the United States enter through Florida. And currently we have over 1,400 non-native plant species in our herbarium records. I want to stress that not all of these species are invasive, but it's a very large number. And in Florida and beyond, we know that biological invasions cause major ecosystem effects. You'll see changes in water and nutrient cycling, disturbance regime changes, increases in resource competition, and ultimately reduction of native species. The photos here on the top, that is a Melaleuca fire. Melaleuca is a tree in South Florida invading the Everglades. That has a lot of volatiles in the plant that help feed the fire, almost like squirting lighter fluid on the fire. So you'll get hotter, bigger fires in those systems. And then below you see, this is Old World climbing fern. This is a fern that spreads by spores, and where it becomes invasive, it will take over a whole ecosystem and just overtop the native species. And here's another shot of Lygodium. This is just an aerial photo of a hammock island in the Everglades. And everything you see there that looks neon is that climbing fern just overtopping that very delicate ecosystem. We also know that invasive species are expensive to manage, and we did some research with Drew Hyatt, was the lead author on this research, where we looked at how much do we spend in Florida on the control of non-native invasive plants. And just on conservation acres alone, we're spending roughly $45 million per year on the control of these non-native species. And the bulk of that comes from just 3 species, your hydrilla, and then water hyacinth, and that Melaleuca I mentioned. And overall estimates for the whole state exceed over $1 million per year for controlling these species. So very expensive to manage. And then of course we know in some cases you have some of these human health impacts, and just again, something else that got us on the news are these giant African land snails. And there's a fear when we have outbreaks of these snails that they may also carry parasites that can affect human health. Specifically, there's a fear that they can carry rat lungworm, which is very devastating if a person were to get it. So when you think about those impacts and you think about how much we spend and those ecosystem effects, and think about the the general invasion curve, the best bang for your buck, the bottom line there, the one to 100, for every dollar that's spent on prevention, you get about $100 of return on your investment. And in eradication, it's $1 to 25 return on investment. But once you get in that control and management segment, we're barely breaking even. So we want to stay in the prevention eradication arena here and try to catch these species as early as possible. And that brings me to a brief explanation of risk. Risk is the combination of likelihood and impact that something will happen. If an event can't happen and can't have an impact, and there is no risk. If an event is likely to occur, but it will have no impact, then there is no risk. But if an event is likely to occur and it will have measurable impacts, then the risk is there. And you can see this illustrated in this risk matrix. As the impact increases from very low to very high, the likelihood very low to very high. Once you get into the orange and red, your risk is high. So at the University of Florida, the IFAS assessment was created in the late 90s to try to identify these species and provide recommendations to the public, these species that might have a higher risk or the species that might also already be invasive in the state. And to do this, we have 3 tools. The first is the predictive tool that we use to evaluate the risk before a species enters the state. And the example here is multiflora rose, probably something that you're familiar with, but we don't really have a lot of it down here, only a few points in the panhandle. The status assessment we use to evaluate species that are already here. So for example, hairy indigo is present in the state. So we use this tool to diagnose that invasion. And the third tool is the Infraspecific Taxon protocol, or the ITP. We use this one to evaluate the invasion risk of cultivars. So just to take you through each of the tools in a little more detail, the predictive tool is a risk assessment protocol that's been modified for Florida. This is based on the Australian weed risk assessment. And what we've done is changed a few questions within that protocol to tailor it to our climate and our soil types, precipitation. We use this to evaluate species that are new to Florida or species that are proposed for a new use. An example of a new use would be species that are being considered for biomass plantings. So your biofuel species, some of the biomass planting, they've been proposing different bamboos for biomass planting. So those are the kinds of new uses we would consider. And to date, we have about 200 species evaluated with this tool, including Vitex rotundifolia beach vitex, which is a dune invader in the Carolinas that's just starting to pop up in Florida. This tool has it's a series of 49 questions that are divided in the history biogeography section, where we consider questions about domestication and cultivation history, that climate matching, and whether it's weedy elsewhere or invasive elsewhere. The second section is life history and ecology, and this is where we consider reproduction traits, dispersal mechanisms, and any persistence attributes of that plant. Each question is answered for the most part with a yes or no answer, and there's a score that goes along with each of those answers. We tally up the cumulative score. Some answers will take points away, some will add them. And that cumulative score, anything that is below 1 is a low risk for invasion. A 1 to 6 is an evaluate further, and over 6 is a high risk. So shifting gears, we slide into the status assessment here. And again, this is a tool that's used to evaluate species that are already present in Florida. we describe the status of that species based on the ecological impacts, potential for expanded distribution, how hard or expensive is it to manage, and lesser consideration to the economic value. And you can see I have a map of Florida here that's separated into 3 zones. One species can have different conclusions for each zone, just considering the way the climate differs from North to South Florida. And to do this tool, we really rely on land managers, and our equivalent down here of prisms are our SISMAs. So I have a lot of participation from folks in the field, the boots on the ground, to provide data so that I can complete this assessment. The final tool is the Infraspecific Taxon protocol. And again, we look at cultivars, varieties, and subspecies of these cultivars of where the parent plant is a known invader in the state. And we want to determine if the recommendations for the resident species, that parent species, applies to the cultivars. Typically, this is an internal tool. We've used it a couple times with the Department of Agriculture to consider some exemptions from our noxious weed list. But for the most part, we look at cultivars that are developed here at the University of Florida. Interestingly, this tool is written into policy, university policy, and the first step for releasing a cultivar is that it goes through this Infraspecific Taxon protocol. And if it's deemed to be invasive, for the most part, you know, university administration will not approve release of that cultivar. I think only one time have they gone against our recommendations, and that was with a sorghum cultivar. But we ask questions about whether the taxon is a distinct entity and if it will behave differently than the parent species. Specifically, we're looking for traits or domestication and breeding to reduce fecundity, and also we consider vegetative spread. So we have over 900 species in our database. You can filter by conclusion, zone, growth form, etc. And then we've set up our database to where you can download a filtered list or the full list into Excel. I invite you to go to assessment.ifas.ufl.edu. When I put this website together, I put the content in there to try to make it not only informative, but visually appealing. So a lot of the photos in there are pretty neat. But if you have a specific species that you're looking to look up, you can just type it in that center, type here to search by species name. If you want to look at all the assessments, just click at view all assessment, and you can scroll our list. So that brings me to talk about the new developments at the assessment. We've had a really good year. One of the things that we were awarded a Farm Bill award to improve our predictive tool, or the risk part of our program. So we're working with USDA APHIS PPQ. It's the Peril Lab, and forgive me for forgetting what all of those letters mean. But they have developed a version of the AWRA, or where they retain many of the questions and remove the questions that are unimportant historically or difficult to answer from that initial risk assessment that we're currently using here. And one of the things that's really neat, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but what it does is it divides the risk prediction into 2 elements. So you get an impact score and an establishment and spread score. I find that the results of this risk assessment are more descriptive when you're trying to communicate risk with important stakeholders. It also incorporates uncertainty, which brings their program closer into an alignment with international standards, where uncertainty was identified as something that should be included in all pest risk analysis programs. And it also adds geopotential models. Now, this graph I'm showing you here, when they developed the tool, what they did is put known major, minor, and non-invaders into the model. And you can see those plotted with this scatter plot here. And they use this to develop the thresholds for what is low risk, moderate risk, evaluate further, and then your high risk species. So here's what it looks like when you have a scored species. The black box here is the score. So when you're running these models, it puts in your, you answer the questions, you assign your uncertainty, and then at the end, it runs a logistic regression model to place your final point. So that goes right here. And this species ended up in the high risk category. It has relatively moderate impact potential, as you see here, around the 2.5, but it does have a very high establishment and spread potential. So this is a high risk species. And then here you can see this uncertainty. So once you place your uncertainty score or your uncertainty rating next to the question that you're answered, at the end of this model, you run your uncertainty analysis. They use a program called At Risk, which does cost, but we're working on developing a free version of that here in my office. But what it does is run Monte Carlo simulation, 5,000 Monte Carlo simulations to create this box around your prediction. And what you want to see is a tight box with relatively low outliers. And so it's almost like a confidence interval around your prediction. And then I mentioned the geopotential models. We hired a GIS analyst, Sakman Kim, has been working with PPQ-WRA to develop these geopotential models, where we've incorporated uncertainty into their existing model. This is a map for Polonia, the princess tree, and you can see the different colors of, or shades of red, where the uncertainty goes from negligible to high. The pros of the AWRA, I'm going to just take a moment and compare the two. The AWRA is very simple, and it's used globally, and it's very accurate across multiple geographies and scales. So Bonin Island's a smaller island, Florida is a smaller area than the continental United States or Australia. Very consistent accuracies when we've done similar tests, putting known major, minor, and non-invaders through it. It requires no additional software, such as that at-risk program I mentioned, or ArcGIS, and risk assessments take about 1 to 2 days to complete. The pros for the PPQ-WRA is that the risk prediction is more descriptive. It is independent of geography, so that geographic suitability is applied in tandem, but your risk, you can communicate your risk prediction and then whether or not your geographic suitability overlaps with that prediction. And this model incorporates uncertainty, again, bringing us into international compliance with international standards. The cons of the AWRA are that the results are presented of just one simple score. There's no uncertainty incorporated, and it does tend to identify major invaders more accurately than non-invaders. We tend to, living in Florida, we tend to err on the side of being conservative. We're risk averse, so this isn't really a problem for us, but it's something to consider. Cons for the PPQ-WRA is that it's not as universally familiar. I believe Tony Koop at USDA published his paper on this model in 2012. The Australian weed risk assessment has been around since the late 90s. There's more of a learning curve to complete this model, and it does require that ArcGIS and at-risk software to complete. So the next thing that we've had going on here at the IFAS assessment is we were awarded a grant to conduct a horizon scan to try to identify invasive species threats to the state. So just to quickly define horizon scanning, It's a systematic examination of information to identify potential threats, risks, emerging issues, and opportunities to inform policy, regulations, and decision-making. Typically, this is done in business, pharmaceuticals, different kinds of technologies, but more recently, it's being used to consider natural resources and specifically invasive species threats around the world. But generally, this is our best guess to identify the unknown. So our particular horizon scan, we're doing two things. We're identifying pathways. We want to identify any new pathways for non-native species to enter Florida. Thinking about pet trade, new shipping routes, packing materials, and tourism. Give the example of ants. Ants are apparently becoming a thing for pets, and there's little to no regulation on shipping these things around the world. You can get a queen from overseas. They'll pack her, pregnant queen, and she can live up to 5 months without food, shipping this stuff around. So this was something that a good example of an emerging pathway. And what we would like to do is rank old and new pathways in order of concern and present those to our stakeholders. And then in terms of the actual species that we want to identify or going to work to identify, we're thinking in a 10-year time period, identify species that are most likely to make it to Florida in the next 10 years. So there's a four phases to our scanning. Assemble the working groups. We've divided those into marine, plant, vertebrate, and invertebrate. In this consultation between experts phase, we're knowledge gathering and sharing, selecting our species of consideration, conducting our rapid risk assessments, and then developing our initial consensus rankings. The review phase, we're going to review those risk assessments, refine our confidence of our ranking, and refine our ranking before we bring it all together. The final phase, we're going to work on our deliverables, and we'll use consensus building to get our final list. And that ranked list of invasive species threats to Florida will be one of our deliverables. Identification of those new pathways, technical reports, and peer-reviewed publications. So again, we've got these four teams. We have had our first meeting, and we are currently working on assembling our lists. We have our rapid risk assessment tool worked out, and we're planning our timeline for completing this task. So just wrapping this thing up, we do have opportunities for collaboration. We will be offering a week-long workshop to train users on how to implement the PPQ-WRA model. We're shooting for May of this year to throw this workshop here in Gainesville. Cost to attend is, there will be no cost to attend. We're just asking for folks to pay for their own travel and hotel. We do have funding to cover breakfast and lunch and snacks at this meeting. We're currently working with Georgia EPSI to develop a semi-quantitative screening tool to aid in the listing of non-native plants. So if you've seen some of these IPSI and EPSI lists, you'll see no consistency among how we talk about the plants, category 1 versus species of concern. And there's no consensus or no standardized way of actually evaluating the species and where they should go on those lists. So Georgia EPSI reached out to me on trying to come up with this, a simple way to sort of put some muscle behind their recommendations. And if this works, I'm thinking about branching out and trying to bring more folks on board to use this tool. And then finally, that consensus building portion of the Horizon Scan, we're shooting for June 2020 to finish that out. So stay tuned for updates on that project. But again, this is our website, the IFAS assessment, assessment.ifas.ufl.edu. If you don't get a chance to ask questions today, you can email me directly at dmlieurance@ufl.edu. And that's what I have for you today.